In this episode, we're going to connect a big idea that often confuses new learners. A policy is not the whole system of control. It is the top layer that must be translated into more detailed documents people can actually use. When an organization says it has an AI security policy, that policy usually states what must be true, but it does not automatically tell a team exactly what to do on Tuesday morning. That is where standards, guidelines, and procedures come in. If you skip these translations, employees still end up guessing, and the organization cannot consistently prove that rules are being followed. In AI security management, this matters even more because systems change, data flows are complex, and different teams may be working with different AI tools and models. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between these document types, how they fit together, and how turning policy into practical documents makes governance enforceable and defensible. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The simplest way to understand the layers is to think about the type of question each layer answers. Policy answers what and why at a high level, meaning what the organization requires and why those requirements exist. Standards answer what exactly must be done to meet the policy, usually in a more specific and measurable way. Guidelines answer how you can do it, offering recommended approaches and options without forcing one single method. Procedures answer how you will do it in your organization, step by step, so work is consistent and not dependent on a single person's memory. Beginners often collapse these layers into one, which creates either a policy that is too long and confusing or procedures that are too vague to follow. Keeping the layers distinct makes documents clearer and more useful. It also improves defensibility because auditors, regulators, and contract partners can see a coherent system. Policy sets expectations, standards define required controls, and procedures show repeatable execution. A strong starting point is understanding that policies should not contain step-by-step instructions, because that creates frequent updates and makes the policy unreadable. Policies change less often because they represent stable organizational intent, like protecting sensitive data and ensuring AI use is accountable. Standards and procedures change more often because they reflect current practices and current risk conditions. If you put the changeable details in policy, the policy becomes outdated quickly and people stop trusting it. For AI systems, change is normal because models and services are updated and new risks are discovered. This is why the document hierarchy matters. You want stability at the top and controlled flexibility in the supporting layers. Beginners should see this as a design choice that keeps the program maintainable. The exam often tests whether you understand that a mature program uses multiple document types to create both clarity and adaptability. A single document cannot do all jobs well at once. Now let's focus on standards, because standards are the bridge that turns policy into required behavior that can be tested. A standard is typically a mandatory set of minimum requirements that teams must meet, regardless of their preferred tools or workflows. For example, if a policy says sensitive data must be protected when used in AI systems, the standard might require access control reviews, data classification labels, retention limits, and monitoring for certain types of output exposure. Standards are written to be measurable, so a reviewer can check whether they are met. Beginners should understand that standards reduce inconsistency by preventing each team from inventing its own definition of secure. This is especially important in AI governance because different teams may use different models and different vendor services, and the organization still needs consistent safety. A good standard is also concise and focused, because standards that try to describe every possible scenario become confusing and are less likely to be followed. Standards should define required outcomes and minimum practices, leaving room for procedures and guidelines to provide implementation flexibility. Guidelines are the next layer, and they serve a different purpose from standards because they provide advice rather than obligations. Guidelines help people make good choices when there are multiple acceptable ways to meet a standard. For example, a guideline might recommend approaches for evaluating an AI system's outputs for unsafe content, suggest ways to structure documentation for transparency, or recommend training practices that help users avoid misuse. Guidelines are useful because AI is a fast-changing field, and organizations often need to adapt without rewriting mandatory rules constantly. Beginners sometimes assume guidelines are optional and therefore unimportant, but guidelines are how organizations teach consistent judgment when strict rules are not practical. They also reduce risk by steering teams towards safer patterns, even when exact requirements cannot be fully standardized. A guideline can also clarify common misunderstandings, such as the assumption that anonymized data is always safe or that vendor services automatically handle compliance. In mature programs, guidelines are curated carefully so they are trusted and used. When guidelines are well written, they reduce guessing without forcing rigid compliance in areas that need flexibility. Procedures are the layer that turns all of this into consistent action, and procedures are often where security programs succeed or fail. A procedure is a repeatable set of steps that people follow to accomplish a task consistently, such as onboarding a new AI use case, performing an impact assessment, approving data use, or conducting a periodic review. Procedures define who does what, in what order, using what inputs, and producing what outputs. Beginners should understand that procedures are not meant to be creative writing. They are meant to be clear enough that two different people could follow them and produce similar results. In AI governance, procedures are essential because many risks come from inconsistent behavior, like one team documenting model changes carefully while another team makes changes informally. Procedures also produce evidence because each step can create an artifact, such as an approval record, a completed assessment, or a review log. If you want to prove conformity later, procedures are a major source of proof. The exam expects you to recognize that mature governance is procedural, not ad hoc. Turning policies into standards, guidelines, and procedures starts with mapping, which is a disciplined way to connect each policy statement to the supporting documents that make it real. For example, if a policy requires that all AI systems have a named owner, the standard might define what ownership means, like accountability for monitoring and change control, and the procedure might describe how ownership is assigned during intake and recorded in the inventory. If a policy requires protection of sensitive data, the standard might define access control and retention requirements, and the procedure might define how data classification is performed, how approvals are obtained, and how evidence is stored. Guidelines might offer recommendations on safer data minimization patterns or communication practices for users. Beginners should see mapping as the process that prevents policies from being vague declarations. It also prevents duplication and conflict because each layer has a clear role. When mapping is done carefully, you can follow a line from policy to standard to procedure and see exactly how the organization expects the rule to be executed. Another important idea is that standards should be written so they can be audited, because standards are often the most direct target of internal and external reviews. Auditability means the standard includes clear criteria that can be checked with evidence. For example, if a standard requires periodic reviews, it should define the frequency or the trigger conditions, and it should define what evidence must exist to show the review happened. If a standard requires monitoring, it should define what types of behavior or outputs are monitored and what escalation rules apply. Beginners sometimes assume that being audit-ready requires huge amounts of documentation, but audit readiness is really about clarity and repeatability. Clear standards allow teams to plan their work and know what evidence they must produce. They also allow leadership to measure compliance across teams and identify gaps. In AI governance, auditability supports defensibility because you can show consistent treatment across systems rather than relying on informal practices. Standards are where the organization makes its expectations measurable. Guidelines, while not mandatory, should still be structured so they are easy to apply, because a guideline that reads like a textbook will not be used. Good guidelines are concise, practical, and focused on common decision points where teams need help. In AI security, those decision points might include how to evaluate whether a use case is high impact, how to avoid including sensitive data in prompts, how to interpret output monitoring signals, or how to communicate limitations to users. Guidelines can also help teams interpret ambiguous areas in standards, such as what constitutes meaningful change requiring review. Beginners should appreciate that guidelines are often the place where organizations encode lessons learned from incidents or near misses, turning experience into safer practice. Guidelines also support consistency across teams by recommending patterns that work well. When guidelines are updated, they can respond to emerging threats faster than policies can, which helps the program stay current. A mature program treats guidelines as a living knowledge base, not as filler text. Procedures should be designed to fit real workflows, because procedures that are too slow or too complex will be bypassed. In AI governance, this is a serious risk because teams may adopt tools quickly and quietly if they feel governance is unpredictable. A good procedure defines clear entry points, like intake forms or approval requests, and it defines expected timelines and required artifacts. It also defines escalation paths when stakeholders disagree or when urgent decisions must be made. Beginners should understand that procedures must account for human behavior, such as the tendency to avoid extra work, because a security program must be usable to be effective. Procedures should also integrate with existing enterprise processes, like change management and incident response, so AI governance is not isolated. Integration reduces duplication and makes it easier for teams to comply because they are following familiar patterns. When procedures are integrated and efficient, they become a normal part of doing business rather than an obstacle. A key challenge in AI governance is keeping procedures and standards aligned with rapid change, because AI systems evolve and the organization's obligations can evolve too. This is why document ownership and change control for the documents themselves is important. Each policy, standard, guideline, and procedure should have an owner responsible for updates, review schedules, and version control. Beginners might not think about version control for documents, but version control is essential for defensibility because you need to know what rules applied at a given time. If an incident occurs, you may need to show what procedure was in place and whether it was followed. Document change control also prevents conflicting versions from being used by different teams, which is a common source of inconsistency. A well-managed document hierarchy supports stable policy intent while allowing procedures and guidelines to adapt as needed. This balance is part of what makes governance mature. It remains consistent in principles while improving in execution. Another critical point is that each layer should support training and awareness, because documents only reduce guessing if people know they exist and understand them. Policies set expectations broadly. Standards define what must be met, guidelines provide helpful advice, and procedures tell people exactly how to act. Training should therefore teach people when to consult which layer, such as using policies to understand boundaries and using procedures to complete required tasks. Beginners often assume training means memorizing definitions, but training for governance is more about building habits, like submitting new use cases through intake and reporting unexpected outputs quickly. Training also helps reinforce why standards matter, which increases compliance because people understand the risk behind the requirement. A mature program also includes feedback loops, so procedures can be improved when they cause confusion or delay. This makes the program more usable over time and reduces bypass. When exam questions ask how to make governance effective, education and process usability often support the best answer choices. As we wrap up, turning policies into standards, guidelines, and procedures is how an organization converts governance intent into consistent, auditable, real-world behavior. Policies provide stable, high-level expectations and boundaries. Standards define mandatory minimum requirements that can be tested. Guidelines offer practical advice to support good judgment, and procedures provide repeatable step-by-step execution that produces evidence. The translation process relies on careful mapping, so every policy statement has supporting standards and procedures, and it relies on document ownership and change control so the hierarchy stays current without becoming chaotic. In AI security management, this hierarchy matters because AI systems change, risks evolve, and organizations need both stability and flexibility to remain safe and compliant. For a new learner, the biggest takeaway is that a policy alone cannot stop guessing, but a well-designed set of standards, guidelines, and procedures can. When these layers work together, the organization can move faster with less risk because people know what is expected and exactly how to do it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.